Now, for this podcast, we're going to be talking about nationalism. And first of all, we need to define what nationalism is. It's actually defined by Merriam-Webster's dictionary as loyalty or devotion of a nation. And this would assume that basically is that remains as nothing more than that. Uh, and it would, if you look at the second one, we see a nationalist movement or government. This would mean that essentially would be loyalty to the nation that a government would essentially run. That would boil down to essentially what we talked about yesterday, which is the idea of sovereignty, essentially running a government for the sole needs of the actual nation itself, not actually running for the actual needs of the world, actually running for its own citizens. And when we have each of these nations doing this, we will find out that basically that each nation is going to try and protect itself. Each nation is going to try and defend itself, and it's going to create some type of equilibrium between each of the nations, and you're not going to find an actual sense of war because you're not going to find nations ganging up on each other because other nations are essentially working out of their own need of what each nation's going to find is in their best interest. This means you're not going to find one nation trying to police the world. You're not going to find a group of nations trying to police the world or a section of the world. And you're not going to find any type of one nation trying to force its beliefs upon other areas. Their only concern is going to be basically looking out for what's in their own best interest and nothing beyond that. Now, when we look at the term of patriotism, it's a love of one's country. This essentially would boil down to a little bit more of an individual's idea of it, but it still boils down into what nationalism is. It's no different than basically a governmental expression of what patriotism is. And this is something that should be known for what it really is. Now, what becomes a problem is when we see this thing applied to National Socialism. This is what we call Nazism. Essentially, what Nazis were they were not a right-wing party. They were the National Socialist Workers' Party. In modern day speak, this is essentially the Democratic Socialists of America or any other democratic socialist group. What we end up finding with them is they end up using the guise of what they deem as what they would use as nationalism, but they're pairing it with socialism. Now, what the actual evil of it is not the actual nationalist ideas of trying to do what's best in the interest of the nation, but actually right here with the socialism, and that's the actual evil. Now, most people try to say, oh, socialism is good, it's sharing with everyone, but that's not really what the case is. Now, when we look at what socialism is, it's any economic or political theory advocating for the collective or government ownership administration of means of production and distribution of goods. Now, what does that mean? That means that essentially the government owns everything. Essentially, you are a slave to the government. You own nothing. There's no private property. You can't own or claim ownership of anything. Government essentially owns you. They own the property. They own everything. Now, on smaller scales, what we find is if we look up the term slavery, you will find very much so that the actual definition is very, very similar. Is the state of a person is basically the practice of slaveholding. Slaveholding would essentially be the owner of slaves, essentially the ownership of people. When we see that as used in conjunction with socialism, well, socialism is essentially the collective and governmental ownership of the means of production and distribution of goods. Well, when we look at the same thing of slaveholding, that's essentially the exact same thing. Thus, why National Socialism was bad. It wasn't the nationalist part of the equation, it was the socialist part of it. And now we get to another part that ends up happening that's often bad, which is protectionism. Now, protectionism is essentially the rejection of free trade. Now, free trade, with it, you will find often it's, as long as it is reciprocated on both sides, it's excellent. But what ends up happening is we get these multilateral trade deals, which they tend to call free trade, but technically they are not, because they usually end up being crony deals. What we end up really needing as free trade is it usually ends up happening through bilateral deals, or when people are actually available to trade from individual to individual, in which government really does not even need to be involved. So what protectionism is basically stating that we need to protect these workers' wages from going down, so we'll protect a certain industry from price distortions and in our country because we want to protect their wages. So what ends up happening is it causes the price of goods to go up, and then this in the end ends up causing lack of trade partners, because you're essentially trying to block other countries from trading with you. It also happens when you actually do actions of blocking others from trading with certain people you don't like, or certain countries you don't like, or even sanctioning countries. This is also another method of protectionism. Anytime where you basically want to try to protect your country, and you'll find this with both sides with it. With both Republicans and Democrats have acted upon this, stating that they'll make the argument middle income wages are falling too low, so we need to protect that. Well, you don't need to protect anything. You need to essentially let the economy work as it needs to work. What needs to happen is you need to essentially let free trade work on its own. And as things will develop, you're going to see that it's going to be making life better for everyone. And this is how things work. And you're gonna find a lot of protectionism in what we call democratic socialists, because essentially what they are national socialists or Nazis. And I hate to tell people, but that's what they are. As we see, they're linked up with a lot of these groups that are essentially the same thing as we found with unions and such, and the same way that they were founded in early turn of the century Germany, and they were the same exact thing that the Nazis were. And when we look at that, we see that it's really that's pretty much a core thing for socialism, to actually do this, to block people from actually developing, because they're more into actually pandering to their support group. But in itself, nationalism and patriotism are not actually bad on their own. It's what ends up getting paired with them. When protectionism and socialism go with them, that's when things go bad. If you have nationalism with free trade and patriotism with free trade, you're never going to have a problem. You need nationalism, patriotism, free trade, and capitalism. These things are good. Socialism, protectionism, uh, these things are the things that are considered bad. And that's what needs to be understood. You need to have an actual reciprocated free trade system, and you need to basically ensure that basically that the actual price of goods goes down. Prices of goods going down is not a bad thing. That ensures that people are going to have a fair price that they can pay, so that their money actually goes further. Just by protecting unions, you're not going to help anybody out. All you're going to be doing is essentially helping out a small bit of people and robbing the rest of the country just to buy votes, essentially. And this is essentially the way politics works. So if you want to actually be productive, you want to get rid of protectionism and get rid of socialism. Nationalism and patriotism are not bad. It's things actually linked with actual slavery that are actually bad, such as protectionism, which essentially makes you essentially a slave to whatever the government intervention is, which is protectionism, and it makes you essentially, and slavery is no different than socialism, because essentially you are owned by the government. And I hope you like this one with it. I know it's going to anger a lot of people on the left that have probably taken notice to this. But if you do like it, subscribe, click the notification bell. Please comment on this video or any of the other videos. I'll get back to you on it. Please share it and tell other people to subscribe to my channel. Because as you probably notice on now, with that I am on disability, so I want to get off that and actually earn a living. So I will see you guys tomorrow. I know it's a little bit of a shorter video, but because it was a continuation from yesterday night's video, it's going to be a little bit shorter. And see you guys tomorrow night, and that's about it.